Luo had never been the kind of person who needed anyone's help. Orphan young, he'd built everything himself. Scholarships, discipline, reputation sharp enough to carry him to the final stretch of a PhD in economics. He was, by any reasonable measure, a success story still in progress, which made it all the more absurd when a freak storm ended his life in an instant, a bolt of lightning finding him in the wrong place with no warning whatsoever. He woke up somewhere that defied description, a white room, the kind of white that felt less like a color and more like an absence of everything else. Seated across from him was an old man who introduced himself, with the calm of someone accustomed to impossible conversations, as God. The explanation was brief and carried no comfort. A storm had occurred when it shouldn't have. The weather system had been mismanaged at a cosmic level, and Luo had been standing in the path of the correction. His death was no one's intention. It was an error in the bureaucracy of the universe. God could not send him back. The laws governing the world he came from did not permit it. The machinery of cause and effect would unravel in ways too complicated to risk. What God could offer instead was a choice: rebirth in another world entirely. A place called Samos. A world similar in feeling to Earth's medieval period but saturated with magic, populated by races that Luo had only encountered in novels. Elves, dragons, demons, and more besides. Luo listened carefully. He was, above all things, a methodical thinker. God showed him a comparative breakdown of the available races, their average attributes, and cultural development laid out for evaluation. Luo studied it with the same focus he'd once applied to macroeconomic models. He ruled out elves almost immediately, primitive hunter-gatherers at their foundation, regardless of magical ability. The numbers pointed clearly toward humanity: high intelligence ceiling, developed civilizations, strong institutional frameworks. He chose to be reborn as a human male. For social class, he chose the household of a powerful duke. Having grown up without parents, without the warmth of a family that simply existed for him, he wanted something specific, not power for its own sake, but stability. A household that loved its children. A life where comfort was not something you had to fight for alone. God granted him 3 gifts for the journey. The first was endless learning, a skill that removed the ceiling from any profession he chose to pursue, provided he was willing to work for it. The second was voice to the heavens, allowing him a weekly conversation with God through any church he visited. The third was language understanding, which would allow him to communicate instantly in any tongue of the new world. A flash of light, a transition. Luo ceased to exist. Ars Blondfield began. The first thing Ars understood about his new life was that his wish had been granted more thoroughly than he'd expected. He could not yet move with any real control. The body was a newborn's body, soft and uncooperative, ruled entirely by needs that expressed themselves as reflexes rather than decisions. His adult mind sat behind eyes that could barely focus, processing a world that came in blurred warmth and muffled sound. But even in that reduced state, he could tell. His mother, Elvie, was beautiful in the way that certain people are beautiful, not simply in the arrangement of features, but in the total quality of their presence. She had spent his entire first day doing nothing but watching him sleep, her expression cycling between exhaustion and a kind of wonder that she clearly could not help. She was, he understood without needing to be told, deeply and genuinely in love with him. He was a few hours old and already the center of someone's world. His father, Vikshir, head of the Blondfield ducal house, was a man who wore cheerfulness like a well-fitted coat. When the news of Ars's birth spread, he announced it to every worker and resident in the duchy and declared a 7-day celebration across the entire territory. This was not, Ars gathered, an unusual response from him. He was the kind of person who responded to joy with more joy, and who trusted that the world would generally cooperate with his enthusiasm. The Blondfield name meant something in this kingdom. The house was nearly 1,000 years old, one of the founding pillars of the kingdom of Igahawk, with a history written in military service and political alliance. The birth of the first heir was not merely a family event. It was, for anyone paying attention, a political signal. Delegations would come. Relationships would be negotiated. The infant currently struggling to lift his own head was already a piece on several people's boards. Ars found this both familiar and faintly amusing. He had spent years in academia, studying the way power reproduced itself across generations. He had not expected to be the mechanism of reproduction. News of his birth traveled faster than he could track. His maternal grandfather, Mike Resman, a celebrated war hero and the military commander of the Western Border, received the news of a grandson and immediately attempted to abandon his post. Only the intervention of his son John, who pointed out with strained patience that the border situation required his attention for a few more weeks, prevented what would have been a spectacular dereliction of duty. Mike agreed to stay, completed what needed to be done with characteristic aggression, and then began organizing the fastest possible overland journey to attend the one-month celebration. In the royal capital, Ars's paternal grandfather, C.L.E. Blondfield, was serving as the king's chancellor when the messenger arrived. C.L.E. was, by all accounts, one of the most composed men in the kingdom, a reputation he had spent decades carefully building. He dropped his papers. He stood there with documents scattered across the floor of the council chamber, while the king watched with visible amusement. He was granted 40 days of leave before he could form a coherent sentence. Ars slept through all of this, bundled in fine linens, completely unaware that the two most powerful men in the kingdom's administration had just been rendered temporarily useless by the fact that he existed. The reality of infancy descended quickly. Ars's adult mind knew what it needed. His body had no mechanism for explaining this with any precision. The first time he was hungry, he lay there for what felt like far too long, searching desperately for some dignified way to communicate the situation, before his physical reflexes simply took over and produced the only signal available. He cried. He was fed. He was humiliated in a way that no amount of prior philosophical preparation had adequately readied him for. His mother found him brilliant for attempting to warn her before wetting her arms. She was not wrong about the attempt. She was simply interpreting it with more generosity than the situation strictly warranted. Ars accepted this and filed it away. The adults of this household were going to see intelligence in everything he did, which was both useful and pressure-generating. He set himself two immediate goals. The first was body control, systematic daily practice of movement that he could disguise as normal infant development while actually progressing through developmental milestones weeks ahead of schedule. Within his first month, he could lift his head and roll with a purpose that looked accidental. Within several months, he could sit. He treated his own body like a newly acquired piece of equipment that required calibration. The second goal was language. His divine gift meant he understood every word spoken around him from the beginning, but speaking required physical infrastructure that had to be built. He practiced his vocal cords with the dedication of a singer preparing for a debut, making sounds that looked like cheerful infant noise to his parents and maids while actually constituting deliberate phonetic exercise. 5 days before his one-month celebration, he looked at his father and said, clearly and without ambiguity, "Baba." Then he turned to his mother and said, "Mama." The garden went completely silent. Victor's reaction was the kind that bypassed the filter between internal experience and external expression entirely. He shouted. He repeated the experiment 6 times, calling to Ars from different angles, until Elvie put a gentle hand on his arm and suggested, with the warmth of someone who was also crying, that perhaps they were tiring the child. Ars allowed himself to perform the words as many times as requested. He had no count of how many times he said them before falling asleep. His parents, he later understood, remembered every single one. The celebration for Ars's first month of life was an occasion of considerable political significance dressed in the clothing of family joy. Guests arrived in order of status, as protocol required, with merchant families and minor local households entering first, then lower nobles who had calculated that personal attendance outweighed the slight of traveling for an infant's party. High-ranking nobles, carefully ordered to avoid any implication of hierarchy that might bruise someone's pride, followed. The arrangement meant that rival families had every incentive to send representatives instead. Showing up in person at the back of a queue felt worse than not showing up at all. After the relatives came Vikshir himself, walking into the hall with Ars in the crook of one arm and his two wives flanking him. The crowd formed a tide of polished greetings. Ars, held up before an audience of the kingdom's most influential people, raised his tiny hand and waved. He had done this deliberately. The crowd's collective smile was gratifying. After the formal proceedings, the family gathered in a smaller group for a private celebration, the two elderly grandfathers immediately abandoning any remaining dignity in their competition to hold him first. Mike Resman, who already had grandchildren, argued that this was irrelevant given his superior emotional investment in this particular one. CLE Blondfield, for whom Ars was the first grandchild, argued that first grandchild status superseded repetition entirely. Ars, recognizing that any choice would create a problem, looked at his mother and said "Mama" instead. Both grandfathers fell silent. "I forgot to mention," Elvie said, laughing through what were clearly tears, that he learned to say "Mama" and "Papa" 5 days ago. The competition immediately resumed, now in the form of each grandfather trying to get Ars to say their preferred honorific first. Meanwhile, across the room, Vikshir was drinking fine wine with Crown Prince William and John Resman, the three of them processing the current version of themselves against the backdrop of who they'd been as young men together. 45 marriage proposals had already arrived for Ars, 31 of them for secondary wife consideration rather than primary. William, who had 3 wives currently expecting children, proposed a future engagement between Ars and any daughter that might result. John, whose family had also produced impressive daughters, made the same offer. Both proposals were accepted with the casual confidence of men who trusted that the children involved would be raised to be worth the arrangement. Ars, who would later have opinions about this, was at the time primarily focused on staying awake. 6 months passed, then a year. During this time, Ars built his understanding of Samos the way a scholar builds a case, methodically through accumulated evidence, beginning with what was immediately available and expanding outward. A month in Samos, he discovered, was 35 days rather than 30. A year was 420 days. The calendar divided neatly into 12 months of 5 weeks each. These were the first genuinely alien facts he encountered. The rest of the world, from its power structures to its social customs, mapped well enough onto the historical patterns he'd spent years studying that he could navigate it with some confidence. His mother began reading to him almost from the start. Fairy tales first, then histories, then anything else that came within reach of his pointed questions. He asked about countries mentioned in stories. He asked what goblins were. He asked about magic. Each question was, in retrospect, carefully chosen to open a door without making it obvious that he was the one choosing the door. His parents found him extraordinary. His mother in particular seemed to feel that his curiosity was evidence of deep intelligence rather than a sign that their infant was systematically extracting information from every adult in the household. She was not wrong about the intelligence. She was simply missing some context. When he was a year old, he learned to crawl. His first solo expedition ended at the library door, which he could not reach the handle of. He sat by it for some time, devising solutions before the maids returned and ended the mission. 2 months later, having learned to stand, he tried again. This time he built a small platform from stacked toys, reached the handle with both hands, managed the mechanism, found a hard toy to use as a lever, and got the door open. He reached the library. He read for as long as he could before the maids noticed his absence and organized a search. He learned that the Igahawk Kingdom occupied the north-central part of the eastern continent and was one of the 3 great human powers of the region. He learned that its founding was an act of brilliant improvisational diplomacy. A general named Igahog I, sent on a campaign designed to kill him, had instead forged alliances with the oppressed elves and beastfolk, won his war, refused to return when recalled, and built a kingdom from the territory he'd taken. The first head of the Blondfield family had been one of his senior generals, which explained the prestige. He also learned that the Blondfield Library had guards now stationed outside it, whenever he was loose in the house. At 1.5 years old, Ars asked his mother the question he had been saving. "Mom, the book says the hero used magic to defeat a dragon. What is magic?" Elvie lit a small flame on her fingertip and said, "This is magic." Then she explained mana, the internal energy that powered it, and the relationship between chanting, imagination, and release. She explained compatibility, concentration, and the way complex spells required vocal precision as a scaffold for mental imagery that wasn't yet complete enough to work alone. She explained this to her 1.5-year-old son for several hours. Ars listened to all of it with the focus of someone who had been waiting for this conversation. He asked follow-up questions at appropriate intervals. He understood everything immediately. He refrained from demonstrating this with too much obvious enthusiasm, which required more effort than the understanding itself. Afterward, Elvie looked at the two maids who had been sitting nearby with puzzled expressions throughout her lecture, realized what she had done, and attempted to recover by noting that she was really just sharing basics and that he probably hadn't understood most of it. 2 days later, she was back to explain mana circulation. The reason Ars found this so valuable was not the content itself. He had read some of it already in the library, but the methodology. Elvie was a spirit-level tactical mage, one of the strongest in the kingdom, and her explanations had the specificity of genuine expertise. When she described how to sense mana, she was describing how she had done it. When she explained the process of integrating consciousness with mana, she was drawing on decades of refined practice. He began training the next morning. It took him 2 weeks to locate his own mana. The amount present in a 14-month-old body was so small it shifted when he moved. But he found it a faint, tentative presence near his heart, and that was enough to begin. The next step, merging his consciousness with that mana, presented almost no resistance at all. The problem, as Elvie had explained, was normally one of proportion. A young child's mana is typically stronger than their mental capacity, so integrating requires sustained effort to force through. Ars's situation was inverted. His mental strength, measured against the tiny reserve of mana in an infant's body, was overwhelming. He enveloped his mana completely on the first attempt. From that point forward, the process of circulation, guiding mana through different regions of the body to expand capacity, working toward the natural ceiling, became simply a daily practice. Not dramatic, not fast, but consistent and building. Every night as he fell asleep. Every morning before opening his eyes. During meals when the conversation didn't require his attention. The discipline of a PhD student applied to the entirely different problem of becoming a mage. Elvie began teaching him in earnest when he was around 18 months old, though she continued to frame everything as basic introduction rather than real instruction. Her passion for the subject was too strong to modulate for long, and within a few sessions she was explaining magical theory with the depth she'd once reserved for graduate-level research. She built a magic research room shortly after this, a project that had been promised but delayed for 3 years due to what turned out to be straightforward neglect on Victor's part, and which was accelerated by a stern demonstration of high-level magic that left him briefly dizzy and the room completed within 2 weeks. Ars continued training. By the time he was 3 years old and asked Victor for a wooden sword so he could begin martial arts practice, he had already accumulated years of mana work. His body was stronger than it should have been for his age, though not dramatically so. He was in this respect a child who had simply exercised more than most. His mana reserves had expanded steadily. He was patient about it because the ceiling was still far off, and patience was something he had in deep supply. Victor agreed to the sword immediately, offered to teach him personally 2 days a week, and began training sessions that were at least as much about a busy duke finding an excuse to practice swordsmanship as about any concern for his son's development. Ars didn't mind. Victor was good, and watching a spirit-level swordsman work, even in reduced, child-appropriate demonstrations, was instructive in ways no book could replicate. The household nights filled in the other days. His routine settled into something he maintained with quiet consistency. Mana training woven through every available gap in his schedule, martial practice daily, reading whenever he could get to the library, and an ongoing practice of appearing to be exactly as remarkable as a gifted noble child ought to be, impressive but not alarmingly so. Ars's 6th birthday party was, by the standards of events he'd attended in his previous life, a significant occasion. It was also, from his perspective, mildly exhausting in the way that public performance always was, projecting the right level of confidence and warmth toward adults who were more interested in talking to his father than in having a real conversation with him. He slipped out to the balcony to breathe. 3 children were already there. They stood up when he appeared and knelt on one knee in formal greeting, a gesture that was genuinely intended and visibly rehearsed, which he found more charming than awkward. He told them to stand up. They did. His name was Kamian Fried, 3rd son of a swordsmanship family. Her name was Isha Vincent, 2nd daughter of a spear training family. Her name was Ryan Zach, 2nd daughter of an archery family. All of them were retainers' children, near his age, apparently at least as bored as he was. He told them he couldn't understand what the adults were talking about and found it quite boring. This was not entirely true, but it was true enough to serve its purpose. Within 20 minutes, Ars was showing 3 new friends the interior of the castle, with Victor's somewhat confused permission, while Dila, his half-sister, 6 months younger, a cheerful chaos of chestnut hair and undirected enthusiasm, ran ahead of all of them trying to look at everything at once. He had never, in either of his lives, been particularly skilled at friendship. This had more to do with circumstances than temperament. The PhD program had not cultivated it. Growing up in the orphanage had given him a different kind of resilience, but not intimacy. Here, though, something about starting from the same baseline of boredom at the same overly formal party in a castle that none of them had explored felt like good ground. He realized, genuinely glad they were there. Within days of his 6th birthday, formal education began. The household hired Lusha, a long-eared elf with blonde hair and the unhurried certainty of someone who had been doing her job since before Victor was born. Over 40 years at the Blondefield Adventurers Guild, managing their front desk and handling their accounts, which made her both trusted and extremely competent with numbers. She would cover literacy and mathematics. KMAN, Isha, and Ryan joined the lessons. LV continued handling magic directly. A martial arts instructor came from Ryan's family, specifically her 3 older brothers, who had useful opinions about the difference between practice and combat. The disparity between ours and the other children became apparent almost immediately. In magic, there was no comparison. KMAN, Isha, and Ryan hadn't yet learned basic mana circulation. Ours had been casting elementary spells for over a year and had already accumulated years of training toward capacity expansion. LV split the curriculum sensibly. The 3 children began with mana sensing, while ours worked on consolidating what he already knew. In martial arts, the gap was smaller. They came from families where physical training was part of childhood as a matter of course. Ours had started earlier, but had spread his attention across multiple disciplines rather than specializing. In specific techniques, KMAN was stronger. Ryan and Isha, developing faster due to the typical advantage girls held in early physical development, were both improving rapidly. Ars's advantage was physical conditioning accumulated over years, which narrowed the gap considerably without eliminating it. In literacy, Ars had known every character in the language for the past year and a half. In mathematics, Ars had an economics doctorate. Lusha, who was genuinely excellent at applied calculation for her era, explained things he had understood instinctively since childhood. He sat through these lessons practicing mana circulation with his eyes open, which his family interpreted as daydreaming, and his teacher interpreted as the natural inattention of a genius waiting for something interesting to happen. He let both interpretations stand. When Dila joined the classroom 6 months later, a girl who had managed to be fully 6 years old and still somehow both younger and louder than anyone else present, 2 things became clear. First, she was average in most things and entirely normal in the ways that her family found slightly puzzling after years of ours. Second, She had an alarming natural talent for both magic and swordsmanship that she herself hadn't yet noticed, which her teachers noticed first with the quiet excitement of people who have found something unexpected. The journey to the royal capital for the Millennium Festival of Igahawk began in the 999th year of the kingdom's calendar, with 50 intermediate-level guard knights, 2 carriages, and 4 children who had never left the Blondfield Castle. Ars pressed his face to the window for most of the first day. He watched the government district give way to the wealthy residential area, where the houses grew from prosperous to quietly palatial. He watched the moat that separated the comfortable from the ordinary, the guards at every bridge performing their small ceremony of authority. He watched the central commercial district come alive with the density and noise of a place that had simply grown into itself over centuries. Open stalls, competing voices, the smell of food from a dozen different sources. He was not, he reminded himself, the person from the PhD program who had never left a city larger than 3 million people. He was a child who had grown up in a castle. He was allowed to find this astonishing. Dila had no complicated feelings about it at all. She simply ran toward every interesting thing she saw until someone caught her and brought her back. The first overnight stop was Carlo Town, a city of 60,000 people built around a nearby dungeon complex that had attracted adventurers for generations, and adventurers had attracted merchants, and merchants had attracted everyone else. The guild there looked and smelled like every adventurer's guild Ars had read about. Functional, slightly loud, smelling of old beer and the specific tension of people who spent their days in professional proximity to death. Vikshir decided to take his family there for a drink. In casual merchant's clothing, giving his name as Vic from the capital, he sat down at a shared table with a family of 4 adventurers, a couple in their late 20s and 2 13-year-old twins named Bri and Leah. The twins immediately attached themselves to Ars and Dila with the confident enthusiasm of older children who have decided the younger ones are adorable and don't intend to ask permission before expressing this. Ars made conversation carefully, giving his first name only, redirecting each time Dila edged toward accidentally revealing their title. He found the twins' adventure stories genuinely interesting. Their first dungeon, their first real fight, the particular feeling of the moment something stopped being training and became something else. He had been thinking about that distinction lately in the context of his own martial arts practice. He listened more carefully than the twins probably realized. 3 days after leaving Carlo Town, the caravan stopped on the plains rather than in a village, and the family made camp as the sun went down. While Vikshir and the adults went into the forest to hunt, Ars led a small group, a few guard knights and a household maid Lulu, to the nearby river to fish. He organized it methodically, using rocks to drive fish from deep water into the shallows where they could be caught by hand. It took longer than ideal and was considerably more chaotic than the techniques sounded in theory, but they came back with enough for 60 people, and Dila came back soaked to the knee and ecstatic. When the hunting party returned and found the camp already organized and dinner underway, Vikshir gave Ars a long look. "I read some books about camping," Ars explained, which was not a sentence he could make sound particularly natural. Elby thought this was wonderful. Vikshir thought it was suspicious. He filed the suspicion in the same place he filed most of his observations about his son, behind a wall of genuine pride that made it hard to examine anything too carefully. That night, Elvy's reconnaissance sphere swept the dark and found them. 200 wolves at the edge of the forest, drawn by the smell of the cook fire. Vikshir announced that Ars would fight. "He's 6 years old," Elvy said, which was the most restrained version of what she actually meant. What she actually meant was that her 6-year-old child was not going to fight a wolf. What Vikshir offered in return was a careful analysis of Ars's current capabilities, beginner magic, entry-level peak in martial arts, and a physical development so far ahead of his age that the usual concerns about young children in dangerous situations didn't straightforwardly apply, combined with a promise to intervene if necessary, and a request that Elvy cast a protective spell without making it obvious. She agreed. She spent the next several minutes furious about it. The knights formed a defensive line. Arrows went first, thinning the packet range. Basic magic went second, and Ars hit his target cleanly. Then the wolves reached the line. The shields went up, and the formation worked exactly as designed, except for the deliberate gap in the third squad's position, through which 6 wolves entered. Victor killed 5 in 2 seconds. The 6 focused on ours. What followed was a fight that ours would think about for a long time afterward. His first genuine combat, with real stakes, against something that was not cooperating. The wolf was faster than he expected in close quarters. He tried to create distance and couldn't maintain it. His sword arm was a child's arm, strong for 6, desperately insufficient for sustained close work against an animal whose entire evolution had been oriented around exactly this kind of pressure. He fell behind. He took scratches. His movement slowed. He thought, I need more. And then, I have more. I've always had more. He started chanting while moving. Earth element strengthening, basic level, the minimal enhancement that made his sword swings marginally more manageable. Then wind element flexibility, which improved his agility just enough to stop losing ground. Then, as the wolf attempted to disengage and reset, lightning element speed. His speed hit intermediate level. The wolf was midair. He hit it solidly. One strike. The fight ended.